Alright, Disciple Making Culture by Guindon, Chapter 5. Live it. Personally and consistently live out disciple making values. And by live out, he means have a lifestyle of disciple making values. I'm sorry, the word leave and the word live from me are similar. Let's begin. What is that? Asked my friend Tommy. He looked back at me, eyes wide open, and faced with a look of deep concern, sitting in his living room. We could hear what sounded like a freight train passing through his backyard. I remember thinking this must be what a tornado sounds like just before it hits. The sound grew to a roar, and our cell phones began to blare of warning signals for a flash flood. It was August 26, 2017, and Hurricane Harvey, which I mentioned above, had arrived in Houston. Our church was not even a year old, and local weather forecasters were telling us to expect this hurricane to produce a 500-year flood event in our already rain-weary city. I jumped up off Tommy's couch, no longer concerned about what we were watching on TV. I went to the front door, opened it, and saw rain pummeling the earth at an intensity I didn't know was possible. I could feel a nervous laughter welling up within me, the kind of laugh that comes out because the kind of laugh that comes out not because something is funny, but because it is simply unreal. Even though we had been watching, preparing, and waiting for the storm for several days, the impact of Harvey was astounding. It shot off the coast of southeast Texas like a bully, brooding, stewing, and building up an anger that would unleash on everything in its path. Since I had spent most of my life living in the Pacific Northwest, hurricanes were not something I had only heard about or seen through new reports. Hurricanes were something I had only heard about or seen through new reports. Now they are part of my personal experience. I will never forget the fury the storm released for 3 days over the greater Houston area. The storm was truly a natural disaster, but it provided an opportunity for the culture of love and real life ministry texts to be tested. When life throws us these intense events, we see how people respond. Yes, the people of Houston as a whole rallied and cared for each other. In the aftermath, which was beautiful to watch, but I wanted to see how those in our church would respond. I wondered, how would they live out the principles we had spent the first 8 months of our church talking about? Would faith translate into action beyond repairing flooded homes? Would they see this as an opportunity to live out the gospel and be disciples who embodied our culture? All these thoughts swirled in my head as the rain poured down. Whoa, did our people ever step up and show up to serve, pray for, and love on our community? For some people at our church, this event was a spiritual awakening, opening doors for them to step out and intentionally disciple others for the first time. When Harvey hit, our church plant was only 8 months old, with around 120 people in regular attendance. Judy, one of our first staff members, took charge of organizing the details, the who, what, when, and where for our church to help the community. She ran our command center, coordinating necessary supplies, mobilizing teams. Calls flooded in, and needs around us boggled our minds and broke our hearts. Fortunately for us, most families in our church did not have substantial water damage. For the few who did, we arrived at their homes as soon as the rain had stopped and the water began to recede. We gathered supplies, rallied teams, and began the dirty work of mucking out devastated homes. Other teams from our church came together and went to help entire neighborhoods which had sustained heavy rainfall. These neighborhoods saw anywhere from 1 to 8 feet of floodwaters in just 3 days. Incredible stories emerged as we served our community. The hurricane provided us an opportunity not just to serve people but also to disciple people. The difference between the two? Serving people helps temporarily, discipling people helps for an eternity. Let me offer you a striking example from Harvey on how intentional leadership can affect how intentional leadership can affect a group of people to make an eternal impact, which is the point of this chapter. Transformation in the aftermath of Harvey. Danny, Melissa, and their kids have been with our church from the beginning of our church plant. But at the time of the flood, they had little understanding of what being a disciple was all about, let alone anything about disciple making culture. They just wanted something different than what they had previously experienced in church. When we began forming serving teams during Harvey, they jumped in to help, going with others from our team from house to house. It was through this experience that they began to see what it looks like to live out their faith. Seeing our team minister to hurting people, pray for them, and go beyond the call of duty by inviting them to join our small groups painted the picture for Danny and Melissa. They were learning that church went beyond Sunday morning services. Their discipleship transformation had begun. As we served families in both the immediate crisis of Harvey and during the weeks of recovery that followed, Danny and Melissa began to take ownership of their faith and live out the culture we all were working so hard to instill. They were moving from being typical Christians who attended church toward being disciples who reached out and cared for others. They invited those they served to their small group and our church services. Melissa invited others she knew to go with her as she served. Discipling others became a lifestyle for Danny and Melissa as they invested into the lives of those around them beyond just the Hurricane Harvey recovery period. The Holy Spirit was transforming them right before my eyes. That time marks a huge spiritual shift for Danny and Melissa. Their faith became alive and active as they obeyed Jesus' command in Matthew 28:19-20. They were going and making disciples. Danny is now one of our elders and disciples other men as well as anyone I know. Melissa also disciples others and helps lead our missions efforts in other countries. In just 2 years, this couple went from attending church on Sunday mornings to actively making disciples of Jesus. The Holy Spirit moved as this couple was immersed in a culture in which they saw living faith. They were given opportunities and challenged to exercise their faith. Our culture encouraged them to grow and allowed them to get their hands dirty, both literally and spiritually. The culture of any organization is driven by the actions of its leaders. Culture is more easily caught than taught. The culture of any organization is driven by the actions of its leaders. I know that I cannot disciple everyone, but a culture where disciple making exists comes back to leadership. It's your leadership responsibility to intentionally build this kind of culture. I invested into Danny and Melissa, and I wasn't the only one. In fact, without the others on our team, there would be no culture. It takes a oh my goodness, see, you in the English language. It takes a plurality of the intentional leaders to make an impact, but change starts with you as a leader. During the first 8 months, our church was gathering together. Danny and Melissa observed and felt the impact of living out their faith. I had personally spent intentional time with Danny, and he saw me living my faith. We shared with each other our fears, struggles, and successes while I coached him in areas of his spiritual walk. We shared life in small group with other guys where we met together to study the scriptures. Parallel to our studies, we did ministry together as I took him on hospital visits. Both he and Melissa were immersed in a culture that gave them practical, real-life examples. So when the time came, and they were given the opportunity to apply what they had learned, they soared. They walked in confidence to make disciples and become influencers. They poured into the lives of new people who became part of our church family, continuing the process of living out a disciple-making culture. Cultivating a disciple-making culture cannot be programmed. It must be lived out. Did you catch that? We must be living out what we say we believe. Little small green cube box says we cultivate culture more by how we live than by what we say. We cultivate culture more by how we live than by what we say. Oh my goodness. No way, I just read the same sentence twice. It must be a sign from the Lord. As I mentioned above, the Gospels are filled with examples of the culture Jesus created as he lived life with his disciples. Let me share with you an example from John 13 that highlights Jesus as an intentional leader. Living it out. This example comes from when Jesus humbly washes his disciples' feet. He gets up from the Last Supper, grabs a towel and basin, and cleans their dirty feet. Regardless of Peter's confusion, Jesus continues to live out this act of humility. Peter objects, but Jesus continues to model and live out a culture of gospel love, knowing that one day, soon, Peter will understand and know how to serve others in similar ways. Peter saw loving service lived out in a tangible way because love and service were part of who Jesus was, not just something he did on occasion as part of a programmed event. Like Jesus in the early church, we must focus on disciple making as who we are, not just what we do. Because of this mindset, our people rallied when Harvey hit. Without question, we knew that we must go. Loving those who need help was simply who we were as disciples of Jesus. This is a critical component, though, that you must catch. The living it out did not stop when the water receded and people's homes were cleared of water damage. We intentionally invited the families we met during the cleanup period into relationship with us. We invited them to small group barbecues and other social events we had as a church family. So even our invitation wasn't just for a one-time event, decision or program. We used a real-life situation to invite them into a new kind of lifestyle. For example, remember Greg from my story in the introduction? It was in the aftermath of Harvey that I invited Greg to my house to hang out and our friendship began. I introduced him to several men from our church, and eventually these men and I had his entire family over for a barbecue. They were invited to be part of our community and our family, not just a church service. Soon Greg and his wife Laura joined my small group. In this way, we began living life together, and God moved them and transformed their family. 1 year after Harvey passed through, Greg said something to me I will never forget. I'm so thankful you did not invite me to church, because I never would have gone. You invited me to be part of something I understood and needed. I love going to church now, but I first experienced what church should be before I ever attended a service. He was talking about our culture. These are powerful words from a man who did not know Christ 2 years before he spoke them. Don't get me wrong though, not everyone we helped had an amazing, happy ending like Greg did. Some hugged us and moved on, others already had church families, and unfortunately, some could not see beyond their current devastation. Harvey changed my life, as it changed millions of people's lives. God used that nasty hurricane to drive deep into my heart an understanding of disciple making culture and the life changing power of the gospel. When a leader and a team are willing to be the church and intentionally live out the message we preach on Sunday morning. Principles of living it out. Walking away from all of this, I learned three critical principles about intentionally living out a disciple making culture. First, intentional leaders must go. In Matthew 28:19-20, Jesus commands us to go into the world and make disciples. Intentional leaders must be willing to go, to be proactive, and lead the way. Leaders must serve Leaders must first serve others, love their community, and share the gospel through action before they expect the church as a whole to do these things. We cannot ask someone to do something we're not willing to do. We cannot delegate going to others. While we release others to go, we never graduate from it ourselves. When you are the first to go, you cultivate a culture and a model for your people, what it looks like. Once you stop going, you stifle disciple making culture. For example, when I visit someone in the hospital, I rarely go alone. I make it a habit to take someone with me. This allows me to model for that person what it looks like to go and minister to others, and it provides time for us to talk and process life along the way. We debrief after the visit and talk about all we saw God doing. This becomes an intentional way to invest into the life of another. Once that person knows what it looks like to love, they can do it too. I saw some fruit from my labor in this regard several weeks before writing this chapter. A man in our church went into the hospital for open heart surgery, and the response from our church caught me by surprise. My dad had been hectic until that point, so I did not have time to grab anyone to go with me. I hadn't expected anyone else to be there, but when I walked into his hospital room to pray with him before surgery, four other men who attended our church greeted me. They had arrived before me and were sitting around his bed getting ready to pray. As I looked around the room, I remembered how each of these guys had gone on a hospital call with me. Now, without prompting, these guys showed up because it is simply who we are as a church. They took the command to go from Matthew 28, and they went. Emotions welled up in me as I saw these men caring for their friend and being the ministers Jesus called them to be. He's called all of us to be like that. They knew to be there because they had seen it, and now they were living it out too. Number two, intentional leaders must be. Churches in our Western culture today are filled with so many different programs, regardless of their effectiveness. What tends to happen is that churches become programmatic. And then the little box says, God is much more interested in who we are becoming than how many programs we can fund, organize, and execute. Okay. We focus more on pulling off programs than on being who God has asked us to be at all the time. To be all the time. Programs have their place, but only after culture. Oftentimes, leaders are exhausted and burned out from trying to execute programs. When a loving culture is a mere add-on, programs are exhausting and promote a culture of busyness. God is much more interested in who we are becoming than in how many programs we can fund, organize, and execute. Take, for example, the hospital visitation. Rather than create a hospital ministry or hire a part-time staff person to make hospital rounds, both of which have their place, let's first focus on building a culture in which everyone believes that they are to live out the gospel. Then, if we still need a program, let's form that program around making the culture flourish. If we focus on culture, people will run to opportunities all day because that's what has because that is what has been modeled for them. They understand what the gospel says and they embrace the lifestyle that Jesus modeled. So when a person from their small group is in the hospital, no one sits around and says, "We better call the pastor." They say, "I'm going, who's going with me?" That's what disciple making culture looks like when it is who we are, not just what we do. 3. Intentional leaders must help people see. Inviting people into your life helps create a culture where people can see a living example. The words you've placed on the walls and in the bulletins become real and practical, where people can see it in real life. This lived mentality is where the rubber meets the road. As a result, when leaders live out the culture, those who have not been in church where Jesus' methodology exists can see it too. Whether we're talking about Danny and Melissa, Greg, or the guys at the hospital, they all serve as examples of the power of seeing disciple making culture lived out. The disciples saw Jesus in the flesh, not just as an evidence of God incarnate, but also as a living and breathing model of the gospel. Those in our church are no different than the fishermen of Jesus. They need to see what disciple making looks like. When you, as an intentional leader, live it out as best you can, you create a culture that reflects what Jesus modeled. That's living it, which helps other people see it. Unfortunately, in the church today, we have replaced seeing with educating, thus creating cultures built on head knowledge alone rather than on cultures where disciples live a certain way. I didn't understand a single thing of the last quote. Let me reread it. Unfortunately, in the church today, we have replaced seeing with educating, thus creating cultures built on head knowledge alone rather than on cultures where disciples live a certain way. Our world is in desperate need of disciples who live out and create a culture of disciple making. Whether serving people in crisis, visiting people in the hospital, or leading people in a small group, you, as an intentional leader, must show for all to see a practical example of what it looks like to follow Jesus in all of life. They must see it in your life. It's not just about action, though. Intentional leaders must also use words to communicate this lifestyle, which is what the next chapter is about. Alright, that was the end.